Hey, it's great to see you all here. What we're going to be chatting a bit about for everyone listening is DevTools and research. We have a lot of experience in DevTools and we do a lot of research here at Unblocked to make sure that our product is useful for customers. But before we get going, very quick intros. I'm sitting with Peter and I'm sitting with Doug. So Peter, you want to tell everyone a little bit about what you're doing here?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm one of the founding engineers on the team, and I'm primarily responsible for the AI pipelines and all the different sort of intelligence aspects of the product. So, yeah, that's the thing I'll be contributing, hopefully.
I'm Doug Purdy. I work a lot on our developer tools overall, but most specifically on what are the new technologies that are being deployed by the frontier models, by all the different infrastructure providers, and how can we incorporate those inside of Unblocked and provide those to our customers and to our partners to really unblock them.
Perfect. Well, thank you. We're going to have fun on this chat. So for everyone listening, get ready for that. But the first thing that I wrote down that I was curious about was you've all seen a bunch of different technology evolutions. So what is the evolution of DevTools from, I wrote VBA to Claude Code,
Yeah.
but we can obviously take that arc wherever we please.
All right. So I'll answer this from back to front, starting from like the ground zero early days where everyone was operating within the simple text editors or in the terminal, and then working with kind of janky compilers and stuff, right? There was no existing sort of context and definitely no existing best practices about how to build software. And so as things got going, obviously like these idioms develop and they get institutionalized either in Linux threads, hi Linus, or within an organization's early documentation systems. But the tools themselves were not super sophisticated. So obviously over time, those patterns evolved and emerged, and we got things like, Visual C++ and some other tooling. Like I started my career roughly around the same time that mobile was starting to take off. It started at BlackBerry. Yep. And we had our own internal integrated development environment that was built specifically for that embedded platform. And the organizational idioms that developed within BlackBerry informed, how to build those IDEs. The way that we shared information, though, was kind of like, hey, Doug, I'm having this problem. Have you experienced this before? Could you help me out here? And that's how the learning transfer happened. And I think a lot of these patterns were recognized, and we started seeing tools like Jira for issue tracking, Confluence, all these different data sources pop up in order to store knowledge and retrieve knowledge. But this kind of created a greater sense of fragmentation, I think, because now not only do you have to bother the person sitting next to you, you potentially have to wayfind across a bunch of different data sources to get your information. Now along comes AI, which helps us to at least wayfind on that a little bit. And that's what these code generative tools do. They have the ability to kind of search around, but they are missing a critical element, which is this kind of like omniscient view of an organization's context. The way I like to describe this is you've got a senior engineer or a really experienced engineer that's brand new to a company. You can kind of think of coding agents like that. They're really good at writing code. They're good at understanding code once you present it to them, but they don't have pre-existing context. So for every task they do, they have to do wayfinding and they have to search against all of these integrations or data sources that I was mentioning before. So now with a context engine like Unblocked, you can transform that new employee into like a 20-year veteran. So now you have like, the expert software engineer that also understands everything all at once of your organization. So that's the uplift. So we've gone from like zero tooling at all to gradually more tooling and then places to store institutional knowledge. And now we're at a place where we're stitching together automation into generation of new content, as well as like surfacing all the things all at once to drive that flow.
Yeah, that's been a phenomenal evolution to actually look at the arc of the DevTools. When I started developing, I think I was like 12 years old, and I got an Apple II, nice. The Apple IIc, if I remember correctly. And you would turn that thing on, and you were dropped into BASIC.
Yeah, welcome.
And you were just there. I can't remember if it was Apple Basic or if it was Microsoft Basic that Apple had licensed. There was Microsoft actually had one of the best basics, which was one of the core reasons that I actually went to work years ago at Microsoft and worked on developer tools there. When I first saw VB, and I think that came out with like Windows 3.1, so I'm really dating myself. And it was this really interesting paradigm where you went from, as Pete was saying, a very textual sort of orientation to something that was GUI based, right, at the time. And you saw this happening not just with Visual Basic, you saw this happening with Next, with their interface builder, which later became a lot of the foundation of a lot of the tools that we use on the Mac. And what was so interesting about it was that you started seeing these different ways, or these different, for lack of a better term, the sort of Hegelian dialectic, not to get too philosophical, kind of falling out here, where you had like a command line and then you had a GUI. Yeah. And then the other thing about VB that was really interesting was that you had this compile time versus runtime difference, where you could literally go in and modify the runtime state. Like you could right click on a thing and you could say, show me the context window for this thing, and I'm going to change it. And then I'm going to save it, right? And then everybody's head just kind of blew up, and especially when VB was put into Excel. And still to this day, I'm pretty convinced that most of the world like runs on Excel and in VBA. Although I'm sure that that's been upgraded. I think Microsoft now has the Power Platform, which does a lot of that kind of work. But you saw these sort of dichotomies playing out. So you saw command line versus GUI. You saw runtime versus design time. And like how those things like have evolved and sort of come together over time has just sort of been fascinating to watch. And so it's so funny now to me, I spend most of my time in Claude Code. Yeah. And that's a command line. I feel like I'm on an Apple II, and if anybody walks by my machine, they actually see the monochrome lookout, which they all laugh at me for. But, those were my favorite days. But the sort of Hegelian dialectic played out even more, where you sort of had this difference between local, which was sort of where VB was, and then the internet happened, right? And then remote happened. So now you have this, is it local? Is it remote? Right. So, that joined in with all these other things that were sort of at play. And then, is it top down? Is it bottoms up? That's another sort of thing that is played out. And even today with the tools, it's sort of, is it inference time? Is it training time? And so watching that sort of evolution happen over time and how they synthesize has been the most amazing thing to see for me. I really remember the magic of hitting the dot and getting IntelliSense. I don't know if you guys remember the first time you ever saw code completion, where you typed in the object name and you hit dot, and there was the list of things. When I first saw that, my mind just exploded. This was clearly the future. This is the way that the world needs to be. And what's so fascinating about that is that was just enabled by some very simple metadata, right? It was like baked into the COM specification, the OLay specification, that was just like, hey, here's a component, and this component has like these features to it. That sort of watching that sort of play out over time has just been phenomenal. Now we're with Claude Code, which if it wasn't for all those previous steps that we just talked about, like it wouldn't work the way that it works today and works so beautifully. And so I'm really encouraged about us continuing to play with these different sorts of ends of the spectrum and then see what emerges over time. And I think for me, it's been the most exciting time that I've seen in DevTools in a long time.
It's kind of like we've hit the reset button in a lot of ways. The paradigm shift is like you see these paradigm shifts in the industry like once every 10 years. I'll go back to the mobile thing. That was a huge shift, and not just in the product space, not just in the way that it transformed like humanity, but very specifically in how people wrote software. It shifted the entire industry towards Android platform, for example, and all the ecosystem that evolved from that. It made people have to think differently about the implications of mobile network communication and the interaction modes there. And so I feel like this is another one of those major paradigm shifts where everyone is like having to think about how they write software differently. And as Doug said, like we're back to CLI. And then you're going to see like the new things evolve. We have no idea what that is.
Because right now it's so siloed. It's like for myself, and when I talk with other engineers and talk to our partners and developers, you think about the swivel chair engineering that you have to do. Like swivel chair engineering was a term, I don't know if it's still a term of art or not, but basically when I was at Microsoft and other places, we would have our partners who would literally have multiple monitors and multiple systems where they would just swivel between these different monitors in order to, this is very common common in the telecom industry. But you're seeing the same kinds of pains that happen there. And I think there's just this real opportunity to bring together something that's like, I want Smalltalk. I was a Smalltalk developer, and I want the runtime to be together with the language, with the documentation, with the browser. And I want Claude PC. Claude Code's not enough. Claude PC is what we need. But even beyond that, what is that new paradigm that developers are going to really enjoy and get a lot of productivity out of?
Yeah. No, I love it because I literally wrote down, it's like, why do you think we got back to the CLI? Because that's fun.
It's a powerful tool, but at the same time, a GUI is a very powerful tool, right? The ability for you to right click on something and then use that as the underlying context that's there. The ability for you to highlight text and say, I'd like to break this off and create a branch of what's going on. If you go into my terminal, it's just like, I have a trillion terminals that are just there, and all I'm doing is swapping between those things and copy and pasting. And so I often say to myself, there has to be a better way. And I'm sure there is.
I think it is an interesting shift. I think it also speaks to how you should ship product, which is when you have something useful and you notice that a pattern is developing within your own organization, test it out, test it in the waters. And that's what the Anthropic Claude Code team discovered. They had this CLI tool that was in its infancy, and people were prefacing their work by interacting with that tool and then going and implementing stuff, and then it eventually transformed into fully implementing the stuff using that tool. So why didn't they integrate it into the IDE? Well, it's because people were getting maximum utility from this tool. I think sometimes people assume that the existing paradigms are the thing that works best for the new thing, and maybe not, right? And so we have to completely rethink these interaction modes.
Yeah. And what I really like about that is you see every single one of these foundation models and larger tool vendors shipping their own IDE. Now, it's Microsoft IDE, but it's skinned, et cetera. Open source is working. And I think it's just going to be really fascinating to see how these things evolve over time. And Pete brought up something that I think is just so essential, is you have to eat your own dog food. And if we weren't building Unblocked using Unblocked, or much like Claude Code is built using, Claude Code, that has to be, you have to be able to feel that pain and not just be going out and trying to sell some product to somebody. It has to be something that you've lived, has to be something that you care about just as much as your partners or your customers do, and that is going to deliver value for other people, and you want to share that with the world. And I think that's a very pure motivation. Now, people got to pay the bills, but I think as long as you are focused on improving your life and other people's lives, then you're doing the right thing.
Also, how poetic. So what research are you the most excited by right now? At this little temporal spot?
Well, selfishly, I think I'm very interested in research around memories. I think that's still research in memories and conflict resolution. I think those are two major unsolved problems. But if I were to reach for the stars and think about far into the future, these diffusion models are looking pretty cool. And they can instantly generate a piece of code. I was having a discussion with a couple of our other engineers, I think yesterday actually, about the value of diffusion models overall for code generation. I think one of the things that needs to be solved is how to integrate the reasoning process. And it's unclear to me, at least from what I've read. I would love it for someone to ping me after they watch it, go, hey, Pete, go here and find out. So my understanding right now is that they're not super great at reasoning. As we were talking about how you could stitch together transformers and diffusion models to interplay the reasoning process between the code generation and do a sort of feedback loop. So I'd love to see where the research takes us on that. That's a very interesting topic.
Diffusion is, we'll see who wins out of this thing. But I think if you look at some of the work that's being done, certainly in image generation there is just mind-blowing. And then some of the demos that I've seen, particularly from Google, that show off diffusion for text generation is pretty phenomenal. I think for me, I've been thinking a lot about the UX. I think that is going to be very interesting to see how that gets stitched together. I'm almost certain that, we don't have the final model here. And I think Unblocked can play a role. One of the things I think is really really interesting potentially is the MCP UI piece, where what I've found, at least using MCP, and I think this is one of the biggest challenges right now, is basically the interoperability between that thing is just very, very difficult. And how you even like set these things up in practice is just like very hard. And you want to have some affordance for the people that are providing these services to sort of have an interaction modality with the end user. So I'm really interested in how that works. It's a la browser plugins, et cetera. Like, you know, how does that work? So that's pretty encouraging to see. I think we need a lot more work in interop. You know, having done the sort of HTTP journey on the internet, I know that interoperability is such an important element of that. And I think that there's going to need to just be a lot of shovels in the ground to like make that work in practice. Another area that's very interesting to me is how we sort of do continuous learning. Like, how do you make pipelines or inference pipelines not only dynamic, and this is one of the core reasons that we do everything that we can do as late as humanly possible. It's because, like, hey, I checked in some brand new piece of code, and is that reflected in the underlying model? And the answer often, if you just use foundation models, is no. And oftentimes, if you have just relied on information from ingestion only, the answer is no, that's not the most up to date. Yeah. And so you want to do some kind of dynamic binding in the system as much as you can. And we do that with Unblocked. In fact, that's sort of our core competency, is like we maximize the signal and minimize the noise that goes into that context. That's the essential promise of the context engine that Unblocked is. But what's really interesting is how can you take the really good signals that you get out of that and then feed that back into the pipeline? Is there a way that you can sort of add that into a continuous sort of pre-training element? Can you use some kind of adaptation of the underlying model in such a way that you can add a tremendous amount of value with not users thinking about, oh, I need to train this thing. Yeah. It's like, it's a natural evolution of what comes from utilizing the tool. And some of that is infrastructure, et cetera, and there's some good research in the space, but a lot of that is like product stuff. And like, how do I tell you that this is not a good piece of information and this is a good piece of information? And how do I do that in such a way that isn't full of friction? I'm really excited about what that pipeline looks like. And again, that goes back to the UI in some instances. But the other one that I'm really interested in is security. I think this is actually one of the most valued things about Unblocked in our practice with talking to partners is you can give all your data to an LLM and maybe you'll get a good answer, maybe, but you've just given up all your data and you've given up a tremendous amount of noise into that system. And so how do you think about the security access that you give to these underlying foundation models? And how do you make certain that the users have the data that they need in order to get their job done? And so we've spent a lot of time, I know Pete has in particular, building up Data Shield. That's the product name that we use this. We use a DSAC as our internal name. Everything has a marketing
source
name.
Access Control. Let's just be sure to spell that one.
Yeah, that's right. Otherwise known as Data Shield. And I think this is a really core part of the underlying value that we deliver to enterprise customers in particular. And so I think those three areas, the UX, talking about continuous learning, reinforcement learning in the system, and then security, are really areas that we spend a lot of time making certain that we're providing to our partners and to our customers.
Yeah. I mean, it's fantastic in seeing the outcome of that because like you get exactly the information you need and none of it that you don't is the hope. And we promise it's the product promise. And we do a really good job of it. Like I've seen it, like I've reduced like the number of loops with like an agentic system from like 10 back and forth to just getting to where I need to be. And then I'm working on the outcome I'm trying to get to rather than the, you got all the wrong context here, like problem, which I love. What are some of the techniques that we've tried and maybe thrown away as we've gone in exploration of that? I mean, Peter brought up earlier, like conflict resolution. Sometimes in an org, something says this is true and something says, no, this is true. Yeah. That's a conflict. But like, how do we leverage these types of things to like pursue that pure expression of like, here is the high signal thing that you need? Because also there's a concept of who are you and what do you need as well in an org?
Yeah, I'll try to answer this as briefly as I possibly can. The first angle to take with this is that context is actually a deeply personal thing. You can't think of context as some sort of global thing that's the same for everyone, that you always just kind of smash into a context window. The first thing is personalization. What does a person do? Who are they? What do they work on? Who do they work with? Those elements are kind of like the critical piece of the puzzle to figure out how to focus the data and filter it and get rid of the noise.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that we focus on a lot. No pun intended, focus. Yeah. Sorry.
Say context once more.
I'll say context and focus many more times in this conversation. No, like, so that's the one thing that I think is super important. And then of course the security aspect that Doug was talking about. So you could expand that phrase, all the things that you need, none of the things that you don't, but also like none of the things that you shouldn't.
Yeah.
You may like to know that, but you don't get to know that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That's just one. That's one. Angle. That's one aspect.
I know we have many, and like from that research perspective, it's like I'm also really curious, particularly like, have we tried anything and thrown it away?
Most of the things I work on is I'm just
we just delete. If it has Doug in the PR.
I think this is like, we do continuous experimentation. There are things where customers tell us, yes, our partners and customers say, I need a thing. I have never worked with a team that like, you have a problem, we're fixing your problem, whatever it is. I mean, that's one of the magic pieces of Unblocked. But on the other side, it is, as you know, every day there is a million newsletters that come out with, model foo, model bar, model baz, and technique, X, Y, Z, et cetera. And so what we try to do is we look at that, and we do a really good job sort of trying to create a good contextual research window, or applied research, as it were, and look at the ideas that we think are going to add value. And there are, to answer your question, like, well, very early, we looked at fine-tuning as a potential piece of value that we could offer to not only ourselves, building Unblocked, but also to our partners. And what we found in practice is that it turns out the juice was not worth the squeeze. It wasn't worth it in terms of the electrons that we were spending in order to be able to provide the value. It was far more important for us to figure out the context narrowing element of this, rather than trying to figure out how we built the data pipeline and got the right level of feedback. Did we get uplift in some of those things? Sure. Yeah. Like, is there a place for reinforcement learning with fine tuning and different adapter technologies? Absolutely. But for the work that we're doing, what we found was it was far more important to get the runtime inference element of this working in a really good way. So another one, I'll give you another great example, is RAGgraph. So this is, I think it was probably a year ago that kind of blew up as like a thing. And so we took a pretty good look at it. And it turns out you sort of have pre-training, or the training time. Then you have, at least in systems like ours, you have ingestion time, and then you have inference time. And there's sort of a little bit that happens in between there where you have webhooks that are sort of updating your ingestion data, et cetera. And so what we found was you would spend an enormous amount of time synthesizing an ontology, as it were, and then trying to utilize that and leverage that at inference time. There were some elements of that were actually very helpful, but when you looked at the actual cost, it was very similar to fine tuning. And what we found was it was a lot easier for us to basically create the ontology at runtime than it was during ingestion time.
Interesting.
And that's just the way it worked out for our system. I'm certain that there are great use cases for that, but for us, it turns out it didn't work out.
Yeah.
It basically provided the same or lesser value. One of the things that you get from runtime graph construction is that you can reach for live data sources. Yep. And that turns out to be actually a fairly critical element to the whole thing.
Stale data is a big problem.
Stale data is a big problem. The other major one, for anyone that's thinking of using RAGgraph or fine tuning, just be aware that the data that you put in is the data that you get out, which means that if
like
it's
garbage,
it could be garbage in, garbage out. The other problem is, of course, access control. If you train a model on your organization's data, you have basically created a window into your organization's data that you may not necessarily want to share. What happens if we drop that HR document containing everyone's pay data into the training? Whoops. So, those are the kinds of considerations, and part of the big reason why we dropped graph and fine tuning.
Yeah. So what you're saying is you should not check the environment variables in, okay.
Yeah. Definitely do not check your secrets into your repo.
Right.
Yeah.
And let it run. So I mean, you definitely talked through the fact that we thought about fine tuning, which is fun. But one thing that's happening right now in the reinforcement learning piece that you talked about is I'm seeing a trend and a rise in people talking about building RL environments for these agents to like run around in with like an objective, and then you like take all the data out. Is that something that we're even looking at or thinking about? Because like something in my mind finds this like fascinating. We unblock engineers. This is our purpose in life, raison d'être.
Yeah. So I have a good answer to this, and it surfaces in the product itself. So when we think of reinforcement learning, usually the mindset or the framing for that is that you're training a model and you're providing reinforcement learning to get new behaviors out of the model.
Yeah.
But I think that we can expand that definition a little bit to kind of also envelop the concept of memories in an organization. And like, I'll give you very specific examples. So let's say that you're working on a PR. Your PR is getting reviewed. Unblocked, by the way, has a PR review agent. Context is a big part of that. Obviously, like the more context you have, the better a review can get. But there's a craftsmanship element to it as well. And there's this thing that we do where we determine an organization's best practices by kind of like going through historical pull request data and figuring out where those best practices lie, how frequently they show up, and so on. And then that factors into the review. So it really uplifts the quality of the reviews. But there are times when either the review will be slightly wrong because of some organizational context that's not currently encoded in the corpus, or, this could just be like not from a review that Unblocked provides, but just general commentary on a PR. So in that sense, you can correct behaviors that are exhibited by agents that are not quite right. And so you can think of that as like reinforcement learning, because people are literally telling you what's not correct. And so you should take that information and do something with it, projecting that forward into the next series of pull requests and kind of remembering that information from the past, redistilling the existing memories to incorporate that new information. So that's the way that I think we think about it in a non-training context.
Right. Yeah. Another thing that we actually were exchanging, like whatever Slack messages on this morning, but there's like a new agentic coding harness. And one of the things that they do is based on how you interact with it, it slowly learns and dynamically rewrites its prompts based on essentially how you want to work with said CLI coding agent.
Can I say the name?
Of course you can.
It's Letta. Everyone knows Letta that works with memory. But
yeah. So, which is fascinating to me. But one of the things that I wanted to discuss here with all of us is like, if you look over here at human systems, notably social media, people can construct echo chambers. I am concerned that if we dynamically rewrite prompts because you like VBA, Doug, whatever, it's going to like lean on that and then just start to basically ignore other data because like it knows what you like. But in engineering, I find everyone I work with and across all the companies I've ever been, like, it's like they're incredibly curious people. We reach for new tools. We try new things. Do you want something to like, confine into? It's like there's organizational best practices in the pursuit of accomplishing things as a company, and that matters. Yeah. But then we don't want an echo chamber. Like this could be bad.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I don't know enough about Letta's agent to know if they've solved that particular problem. But yeah, there's a danger, of course, that when you continue to pull on existing historical data that you might accidentally like converge on something that's bad. I'll give you an example. So actually, this is one of the experiments that we ran that we tossed out. This is a great example. Initially, when we first started, we were capturing the answers that Unblocked gave and incorporating that into the corpus. Yeah. And like the obvious thing that does is it converges all of Unblocked's answers to its past historical answers, even if they're wrong.
Oh no.
So you need to, like, if you're going to do something like that, then you need to have reinforcement learning product features that allow users to correct the behavior. But that's putting the onus on the customer to do that. And so, you're kind of better off not taking that approach, at least to start with. I think that I am concerned about agents that rewrite their own prompts. There has to be some guardrails or some like anchoring thinking process that prevents that from happening.
Who watches the watchers, Pete?
Who watches the watchers? Yeah.
Not while I'm drinking, Doug.
See, we've got AI that's doing code review. And why is that important? Because AI is writing code that needs to be reviewed more scrupulously. And now we're going to need AI that takes a look at those reviews and judges them, which Unblocked does, by the way. So when does it stop? You could apply the same thing to humans, I guess. But
you could. And evolution has a great answer. It's like, yes, those echo chambers will like basically eat themselves. And then those cells die.
So MK killer cells. Got it. Perfect.
Well, I think the immune system is actually a really good analogy to the way these systems are going to operate in practice, which is where you're going to spool up a sandbox and the agent's going to operate in that sandbox and you're going to see what it does. Yep. And if it's a trustworthy agent, then you're going to let it do more stuff. And if it's not, then you're not.
It's like, will we let it out of the box?
Yeah, that's right.
That's the only question.
And will it convince you to let it out of the box? It fundamentally boils down to trustworthy computing.
Trustworthy.
Yeah.
No, sounds valid. I'm into it. Well, I mean, first of all, this has been very fun. I know you've got a couple
For
more
you,
notes.
maybe,
Yeah,
but
I'm having a great time.
Cut that in
No,
post.
keep it for sure. You've got a few more notes, but like, is there anything else that you want to talk about, like that we're thinking about at this current moment in time, or anything that, you know, we wish we knew more about? The space continues to form. Like that ship today, I just learned about this new CLI. So this stuff is happening very quickly.
I think one thing we could talk a little bit about, and this does talk about some of the research things, is local versus remote in terms of inference and context.
Yeah.
So one of the core things that we did very, very early was have the ability for you to pull in local context and actually feed that into the overall answers with the global corpus that you have. Right. And so Pete worked a lot on this. In fact, at one stage in the product, we could basically see all the windows that were open and actually pull some of the context.
That was before we released it to customers. I just want to be
Of
very
course.
clear about that. It was an experiment. It was for sure.
Safe in the box.
Yeah.
In the box. Yeah.
Well, and I think, and you see this was just a very prosaic example, is my local commit tree that I haven't committed to get. Like, should I be able to operate and reason on that thing? The answer is absolutely yes. And should I be able to take advantage of the fact that like my machine has like an M4 with I think it's 96 gigs of GPU memory and is perfectly capable of doing a lot of things. Now, is it a frontier model? No, but there are a lot of workloads that are out there that you want to run locally. And so I think one of the most interesting things that we are spending time on in terms of researching is what is that local global sort of window, and how do you add value across the whole spectrum of development, not just with doing Q&A, not just doing code generation, but observability. Like, you know, if there's an issue on my local machine, I got to rebuild my local machine at least once a week, which is just a nightmare. And if there's a tool that can like help me sort of reason about my local environment, plus the changes that are happening globally, then those are tools that add a tremendous amount of value. And so I think Unblocked is uniquely positioned in order to extend that context engine from being not just a global thing that has your enterprise best practices in it, but also has all of your local context that's available to you as an engineer.
Imagine the number of times that you've pulled main and something is broken and you know you just can't figure out what the heck's going on, and there's some conversation happening somewhere that you're not aware of. Like it would be amazing if you just had all that at your fingertips, right? You just like instantly solve your problem for you.
Oh, for sure. Like since being here a pretty short time and working with this tool chain, like in and on our company, the speed gain is undeniable. Like it's just so fun. I'm having fun. This has been fun. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, seriously a good time.